Okay, everybody, this is a slightly different format. I think I mentioned in the last podcast I did on Sir Mark Sykes that I'm doing some stuff for my students at King's Inter High. If you're listening, guys, thanks very much. And also, if you're a student of history anywhere in the world, please tune in and use this as something that will help you. So this is the Explaining History Study Extra, which is the exciting and innovative title I've chosen for this. And it's a bit of an experiment to begin with. We're going to start off by looking at fascist Italy. And the way that I'm going to do things is talk a little bit about some of the context of the topic, and then dive into a couple of extracts from a book which will help to give you a greater depth and greater understanding of the historical context. So we're looking today at Fascist Voices by Christopher Duggan, which I would strongly recommend if you're doing this topic, that this is a book you should read. It's an amazing documentary source. So we're looking today at some of the reasons for the popularity of fascist ideas in the aftermath of the First World War. And we're going to look at a guy called Carlo Cesari. And Carlo Cesari was an Italian soldier, excuse me, who went to war, partly because he believed and supported the idea of the First World War, of Italy entering the First World War, partly because he thought that this would give a sense of national unity to Italy. Why did he think this? Well, Italy had finally been formed in 1870. It had largely been unified in 1861. And Carlo Cesari was one of a generation of Italians who saw that Italy had been kind of politically unified. That Italy's borders, ran all the way around the Italian peninsula, but socially and culturally, Italy was very, very chaotic. People in Naples or people in Venetia did not see that they had much in common with people in, say, Sicily or Palermo or the Abruzzo. Italy is a country of big, big contrasts and huge contrasts in poverty and wealth. There were many commentators who believed that whilst Italy had been unified as a nation, that Italians themselves hadn't come together as a people yet. Mussolini, who during the First World War was a socialist journalist who began to agitate for Italy's entry into the war, believed, and this is a kind of a core fascist idea, believed that war and conflict and suffering and hardship and bloodshed and would be a shared phenomenon. The people on the front line and people in factories at home making munitions would fight and die for the nation, and because they did this, their mentality would change, their outlook, their beliefs, their ideas, their sense of being part of this bigger body called the nation. This would sort of kind of almost mystically somehow be infused within them. This is a very, romantic idea. I don't mean romantic in the sense of kind of Valentine's Day, but romantic in it's a very kind of emotional, a kind of almost idealized notion of how the world works and what it is that makes nations. And of course, as we shall see, this isn't what happens, and Italy doesn't become unified in this manner. And when the war ends, actually Italy is far more disunified and disunited, because of course wars place exceptional tensions on societies. Wars always ask people to sacrifice, and they always ask people who are already poor to become poorer, and they always ask those with the least to give the most in the interests of the nation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into part of of Christopher Duggan's book. Hold on a moment. It was thus to a deeply divided and unsettled country that Carlo returned from the front in 1919. Emboldened by the success of the Bolshevik Revolution and by a rapidly deteriorating economic situation with manufacturers scaling down production from wartime levels, unemployment mounting and inflation soaring, socialist leaders urged Italian workers to militancy. Strikes, lockouts, factory occupations and riots became commonplace. At its Bologna Congress in October 1919, the Italian Socialist Party proclaimed the Russian Revolution to be the most auspicious event in the history of the proletariat, and demanded that the instruments of oppression and exploitation of the rule of the bourgeoisie, states, communes and public administrations be replaced with new proletarian organs. It called on its followers to make use of violence for the defence against the violence of the bourgeoisie, for the conquest of power, and for the consolidation of revolutionary gains. In the streets of major towns and cities, supporters of the socialists taunted officers in uniform as vile warmongers and capitalist lackeys, and even ejected them from trains and trams. As one returning officer, Emilio Lusu, himself of left-wing inclinations, he was later to be a prominent anti-fascist, noted, "It was a bizarre and politically damaging situation. In the large factories in particular," he said, "the workers harboured the most passionate hostility to the war. They had not taken part in it, but they continued to oppose it, almost as if it was still to break out rather than being over. In practice, this hostility expressed itself in scorn for all those who'd fought, as if for the last 4 years the latter had been on some wild spree. This attitude was shortly to contribute greatly to the workers losing the sympathy of veterans and serving soldiers." So what can we see here? Well, we can see that this division in Italy had a huge part to play in the development of the first fascist squads. The first fascist squads had a large number of former soldiers in them, and many young men who had been unable to fight in the war, often the students, and those who had dreamt about the glory that the war had supposedly brought to Italy, but had been unable to participate in. And there was a sense that the striking workers and the Socialist Party of Italy were unpatriotic, and when the Paris Peace Conference happens and Italy is rewarded with a kind of derisory offer compared to Italian expectations of territory at the end of the war, there is a lot of the anger is directed at those unpatriotic types who had hamstrung the fighting soldiers. And here we see one of the core ideas of Italian fascism. Italian fascism is almost like a basket of ideas. Some of them incoherent, some of them contradictory, but anti-socialism was at the heart of Italian fascism. And the reason why, primarily, is because it was seen as the opposite of creating this idea of a national spirit. The returning soldiers, as far as they were concerned, when they saw striking workers, they said, well, this is socialism. This is a sort of a kind of a troublemaking that we don't fully understand. And if people know their place and know what they should be doing in the kind of the hierarchy of society, then these problems wouldn't exist. And there's a long tradition in Italy of hierarchical rule. If you were an Italian peasant, living in one of the poorer parts of Italy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You knew all about that sort of way of life, where the local landowner was, if essentially the king as far as you were concerned, and or the absolute ruler of your area. And very often local landowners would rely on the mafiosi, in essence, to deal with the problems of peasants who went on strike wanting higher wages and better conditions. So the idea of workers stepping out of line is a really kind of egregious concept that many middle-class Italians saw as unacceptable. They looked at the results, the chaos at the end of the war and the 2 red years in the early 1920s, and they also looked with dread at the Russian Revolution. Bear in mind that by 1919 the Russian Revolution is 18 months old, and the Russian Revolution has already begun a bloody civil war in Russia. The Tsar of Russia has been executed, and there are from Russia every day lurid and horrific news stories about what has happened to the middle classes, to the people of property in Russia. This is frightening stuff, and there is an expectation that it will spread across Europe. By about 1920, the possibilities for Lenin's revolution spreading are pretty minimal. But in 1919, it doesn't quite seem like that. It's actually quite scary stuff. So let's go back to the story of Carlo Cesare. Carlo was horrified by this situation. In October 1919, he was stationed in Milan and found himself abused by socialists who jeered at his bersaglieri uniform and hurled insults at the army and the state. On one occasion, he felt in serious danger and had to get fellow soldiers to come to his help. He was angry at the socialists, but even more angry at the government, which seemed incapable of keeping order and defending the patriotic ideals for which he and so many others had fought. His frustration boiled over into the diary that he'd kept intermittently since the start of the war. What desperate disappointment, he wrote, thinking back to the situation in May 1915 with considerable disingenuousness. The great Italian family that intervened entirely united at the right moment in the Great War is today fragmented, horribly divided and horribly sick, feverish with a dangerous illness, anarchy. Even the women who cheered the returning troops a few months before were now in the piazzas singing Bandiera Rossa, or the red flag. I feel at sea. I cannot begin to understand how, as a result of these vile political ideas, people can hate each other so much that brother kills brother, when instead we ought to all be united in restoring the nation, above all economically, and saving it from the disastrous consequences of the war. His hopes had been shattered. I believe in nothing any longer. He was almost ashamed to be Italian. Above all, he hated politics and politicians, and confided in his diary an oath underlining the words heavily. In the most solemn manner, I swear that I will never again concern myself with politics, that I will never belong to a party. My only political party, my only big ideal will be my family, my father, my mother, my brothers, and one day my children. Of course, he does return to politics. He returns to politics as a fascist. But in a way, what fascism offered was a kind of anti-politics. Someone like Mussolini promised to be the unifying figure that Cesare looked for. The person who said all political conflicts, all social conflicts, all struggles between rich and poor are over, and all there is the life of the nation and the obedience to the nation and to the national tribe of Italians. And this is very seductive. It's very, very attractive, particularly at a time of great social conflict. And Mussolini offered what many Italians imagined was a kind of an end to ideological struggles. If you have one simplistic idea of think, follow, obey, then the great debates of how society should be ordered can be kind of negated in some way. And this was, in a way, in Nazi Germany. Later on, the philosopher Erich Fromm said that one of the appeals of fascism is by 1933, many Germans were so overwhelmed and confused by politics and economics and political ideas and ideologies and all these kinds of stuff. They wanted the simplicity of order, and this is what fascism offers. Okay, so I hope that was useful, and that's just a kind of a quick dive into a personal perspective of a person who experienced these events at the time and made decisions based on the kind of the environment and the historical context and the political and social context they were surrounded by. And if we can sort of look through their eyes, obviously none of us here are fascists or fascist supporters, but if we can understand the mentality of those who are, then it helps us to navigate the past. Okay, hope this is useful, and I'll be recording some more of these history extras, these study extras, pretty soon. Thanks, all the best, bye bye.